Hi, my name is Peter Andras. I'm a professor at Edinburgh Napier University. This is my lecture series on the evolution of complex systems. This is lecture 6, Brain and Mind, part 2 of the lecture 6. So we will continue to discuss about how the neural system as an information subsystem of the organism leads to the development of the mind and how this works in terms of the memory and language within the brain, how this leads to the mind, and we will discuss also identity violations and adaptations in the mind and neural system, and also the complexity of the nervous systems. So, previously we discussed about how the brain and nervous system works, how it builds memories, and how the long-term memories represent communications over the memories of interactions between neurons. So, overall, what we said so far is that you have these patterns of neural interactions which represent these communications over memories. And the communications over the memories of the individual lead to the communications over a kind of internal information system, which is the information system of the brain, where the brain and the nervous system act as the information system of the organism. So the question is, how is this internal information system organized? And how that leads to the emergence of this system itself. So, in a sense, the system tries to define itself and decide what neural communications are correct, what patterns of neural interactions representing these communications are correct, which are part of the correct model or information model of the brain about itself. So this defines the system identity, where the core question is, who am I? Now, clearly, in the context of humans, this is perhaps more obvious, the definition of identity of the who am I answering the question. However, the same may apply in the context of other animals with nervous system as well. And clearly, there is indication that the identity is defined, at least in the case of animals which live more active social lives. So, for example, dogs, but also other animals living in larger social communities. So, essentially, the question here that the system aims to decide is what is part of the I, of the identity of the system, and what is not the I. So, which are, if you like, what kind of behaviors represented or triggered by these communications about the definition of the identity are correct, and what are the ones which are not correct and which should not be generated. So it's really fundamental. It is a communication about the proper interpretation of neural communications, because, as you said, there are neural communications. There are communications about the simpler neural communications, and these are represented again as other neural communications. And the question, what is the correct interpretation? What is the proper interpretation of these neural communications which fit the model of the individual, which fit the model of the I? So the information systems actions are identity definition, identity checking, and identity enforcement communications, or these lead the actions of these. So these are really communications which lead to the questioning of the correctness of the interpretations of neural communications. So is a behavior the right behavior, a certain movement? Is that the right movement? or is it not? So these lead to the intentional actions of the organism, where it explores the environment, checks whether the internal models of the identity, which lead um, to behaviors, are these behaviors correct? Are they leading to the expected outcomes? So, for example, intentional body movement. So, for example, you may consider how the developing fetus uh, learns about their environment. They make a lot of movements. Now, one interpretation is that these movements, or some might be pure reflexive movements, but others appear to be more intentional movements driven by the developing brain of the fetus. Now, these movements check what kind of body movements are valid or which lead to the right uh, expectations about these movements. Now, as a baby develops later, um, they also try out many kinds of movements and select the good movements. Now, one other example which might be relevant is, for example, learning of the sound environment in babies, where they explore the existing sound environment around them and learn those patterns from it which are there. Now, interestingly, in babies which are born in Western European cultures, the distinction between the two kinds of S that is present in Far Eastern cultures disappears because this is not part of the language. In the same way, the distinction between the R and L, which is present in Western languages and cultural environment, disappears in East Asian cultures, babies, because that distinction is not important in their sound environment. So there is a selection of what is meaningful and what is not, what fits in the identity in the context of the environment and what behaviors do not fit. So this applies to movement, but also applies to other behavior, as I noted, like auditory behavior. Now, in the same way, there are also perceptions of the information system. So the question is, what interpretations of these perceptions are the right one? How should perceptions interpreted at the level of the definition of the identity of the I, such that they fit the system? So these are the conscious perceptions. So the perceptions which are put in the context of the definition of the identity of the I in the mind. So these conscious perceptions contribute to the definition of this inner information system and check which interpretations are correct and which are not. Now, the communications between the long-term memories, said that these are communications which happen, which define the memory, and the conscious memories. Now, the language of these communications about long-term memories is effectively so these are memories of communications between long-term memories. So you have interactions between long-term memories and memories of these, and the communications about these memories. So this is what defines the language of the communications about this, the I, the identity of the system, the inner identity, the conscious identity of the system which has the nervous system which produces the long-term memories in it. Now, this language which defines the self-identity. This is the communication about what is intention and what is not, what is consciously perceived and what is not, what becomes part of the identity, of the self-identity, and what is outside of this, what fits this identity and what does not fit this identity. Now, these communications most likely happen in the areas of the brain that we label integration areas, which deal with the communications about these long-term memories. Now, in humans, this is likely to be the language which defines the identity of the self. So it is the monologue about ourselves that we have in ourselves, where we define who we are and who we are not. This is what you need to see is that there are many things that can be done, which are possible behaviors, which are not part of the identity. But these are consciously selected out, which are consciously not perform these behaviors. So we define consciously what is the conscious interpretation and intention action which fits with our identity and what is not. And we have an internal monologue about this definition of what fits and what does not fit our identity. Now, the root of these communications is a question about the definition of the I, question of the definition of the self-identity. So clearly, if you look at babies, their world starts by perceiving themselves and seeing probably everything as part of their world. And gradually, they learn that there are things which are outside of their control. They learn that there are other humans that they can interact with, and certain behaviors that they produce the right behavior from their mother, brother, sister, and other individuals around them. And gradually, they understand that there are many parts in their environment which are not part of them, and their identity, definition of what is the I, develops and is shaped by their interaction with the environment. And this shaping defines this intentionally and consciously part of the I. Now, this communication system about the conscious identity and intentional behavior constitutes the mind. So this is like the kind of core, deep core of the information system, subsystem of the brain. So this is the deepest inner model of what is the individual, what kind of behavior are correct as intentional behavior, what kind of perceptions of the environment and of itself are correct as conscious perceptions. And this core defines, and this core of this information subsystem within the brain defines the mind. So the mind's language is the internal language that is used to communicate about the long-term memories and identity. And it is really the language that is defining the I. What is the I, what is not the I? And in humans, at least, this defines the personality. Possibly the same applies, at least in some animals, for example, in dogs, and possibly most likely in other social animals as well. Now, the communications about the identity of the I adapt, as we said, for example, in babies, but the same applies in animals through their experiences in their environment. And this is mainly driven by the interaction with other conspecifics, individuals of the same species. So it's really, to a large extent, it is driven by the social environment, the definition of what is the I. So that is why previously noted that most likely in animals which have a social life, this social life effectively implies the existence of some kind of personality or mind subsystem in them. Now, the communications about the identity of the I drive patterns of behaviors and perceptions. And some of these patterns of behaviors are perceived as good, while others are bad or correct and incorrect. For example, if you consider the courtship behavior of animals, certain patterns which are produced mostly by individuals of that animal are the good behaviors, good courtship behaviors, which are likely, or at least potentially, are effective. And there are other behaviors which are the bad behaviors in terms of courtship behavior, which are most likely ineffective. And for example, in birds, songbirds, when they learn their song, they elaborate on their song. And they follow other songbirds which are singing. So partly they learn from their environment, from their conspecifics, partly they add innovations to their song. However, it is very clear that certain patterns of songs are effective as courtship behavior and others are not. And the individuals which learn, which are the effective or good behaviors, are more effective, and they pass on this to their offspring as well. So it is quite overall, over many generations, this good and bad distinction in behavior pattern terms gets embedded and emerges in the social context of these animals. Now, in the same way, in humans, there is a distinction between good and bad behavior that the individual learns as they develop. And this distinction between good and bad acts effectively as an anchor, as a referential anchor in the context of communications about the self, which effectively provides an abstract representation of the good and bad, and an abstract reference to label good and bad behaviors. And in humans, it is most likely that this is what leads to the foundation of morality and ethics in a social context. Now, if you look at the mind as a subsystem of the nervous system, clearly there is a boundary of it, as there are dense communications about the identity of the self which involve parts of the brain. Now, I say we do not know clearly which parts of the brain are mostly involved. It is very clear that parts of the cortex which deal with integration of perception and action are likely to be involved, but also it is very likely that parts which involve emotions, like amygdala, olfactory related higher areas, and most likely other parts of the brain which involve in interpretation of conscious interpretation of perceptions and generation of intentional movements and the processing of long-term memories. These all consist substrates of the mind. Now, we do not know exactly which are the parts and to what extent they contribute. However, it is very clear that there must be a boundary where a lot of communications between neurons provide the substrate of these communications about the identity, and it is very likely, given how the brain is organized, that these are relatively confined and there is relatively little communication with other parts of the brain which deal with, let's say, more primary perceptions or action generation. Now, In this sense, it is seen as a subsystem of the nervous system. However, as I noted, it is much harder to define where it is exactly in the context of the nervous system, much less clear than, let's say, in the case of sensory subsystems, where we can identify relatively clearly where these are. Now, the grammar of the language is the conditional continuation distribution rules of human language in the human case, where in the case of animals, most likely, the conditional continuation distribution which drive certain patterns of behaviors, like the courtship behavior or also possibly fighting behavior and others. Now, the meaningful communications are the ones which lead to further communications about the identity of the self. These are the ones which fit with the identity system, which are checked by the identity checking communications and confirmed to be meaningful. The meaningless communications are on the other side are the ones which do not fit the identity of the personality, in the case of humans. These are the ones which end up with contradictions, which lead to identity violations. So, for example, paradoxes about the analysis of the self, where the individual does behaviors which do not fit their identity, which cause paradoxes because they are not interpretable, or they come to the conclusion that these are the bad behaviors which should not be performed. Now, if you look at happiness in particular, what you see is that these however, so how it seems to be is that these are cases where there are expectations about the identity. So there are expected communications about the identity, but these have low probability according to the conditional continuations, continuation rules. And when these relatively low probability continuations happen and get confirmed in the context of the definition of the identity of the self, these lead to happiness. And extreme happiness is euphoria, where very, very unlikely, but still there is some likelihood for these communications, but they are relatively very unlikely. When these happen and get confirmed as correct behaviors or correct perceptions in the context of the self-identity, then the individual experiences, human individual experiences euphoria. Now, just to note that these are quite speculative ideas. So, as I already indicated earlier, you have to take these as speculations, since we have actually little evidence that these work in these ways. However, from the interpretation of the systems theory analysis, these seem to be the correct interpretations of how the brain and mind works. Now, moving on to the other end of experiences, sadness, our interpretation is that this is when the system runs into paradoxes repeatedly. So these are behaviors or communications or about perception, intentional actions or conscious perceptions, where the system's rule imply a zero probability for continuation. So these are experienced regularly, and that questions the identity of the individual, leads to regular identity violations, and these lead to sadness. And the extreme of this, when these happen very many times, very regularly, that leads to depression, which really fundamentally questions the identity of the individual and the validity of the assumptions about good and bad, the validity of the assumptions about their correct intentional behaviors and correct conscious perceptions. Now, moving further, if you think of the system that is experiencing these very regular identity violations, that triggers the restructuring of this identity, aiming to eliminate the violations. And effectively that leads to shrinking of the identity and potentially dissolution of it, or approaching the dissolution of it. And if such failure is experienced, our interpretation is that that might be the equivalent of the suicide assault and the effective suicide termination of the identity of the individual. Now, a further speculative interpretation is that there are multiple personality cases, multiple personality disorder, when an individual human has different personalities and can switch between these. Clearly, there's a wide range of these. Most of them are not so clear-cut switches between personality, but rather more subtle differences in their behavior. However, one interpretation of the systems theory is that potentially the paradoxes lead to developing subsystems which develop individually or separate, or perhaps replicate, and that leads to the kind of different personality expressions which can be very significantly different. However, again, this is just a very speculative interpretation of a potential implication of this theory that we are discussing in the context of the mind. Now, moving on to pharmacological interventions, essentially what happens is that there is the environment in the brain changes. So the environment of the neurons changes because, for example, anti-depression drugs may reduce the reuptake of serotonin, which means that serotonin is more available around the neurons after it is released by presynaptic neurons, which changes the environment of these neurons, changing the behavior of the neurons, and in effect changes the patterns of the neural communications. So as the substrate of the communications about identity changes, there will be changes about the identity as well. So that's how we see the interpretation of pharmacological interventions in the brain. Now, in some cases, these may facilitate the generation of euphoria of, for example, drugs, which allow the person to perceive their world in a way that is very favorable to them, perceive the world in potentially strange ways that become possible continuations, and that leads to euphoria. Or on the other side, they may also lead to depression, for example, lack of drugs in addicts, again by changing how the biochemical environment of the neurons and in effect changing the patterns of interaction between neurons, and in that case leading to more perception of contradictions and challenges to the identity of the individual. Now, adaptation in the mind happens in response to these identity violations. So there are conflicting conclusions about the identity, there are conflicting conclusions about behaviors and intentional behaviors and conscious perceptions which do not fit the identity, and these leads to identity revisions. Now, the identity revisions essentially aim to eliminate the root of these paradoxical situations, and effectively they impose additional constraints or change constraints on the identity communications in order to prevent the reoccurrence of this root of the paradox. As we noted earlier in the baby, where the early stage identity includes everything and the baby sees perhaps everything as part of them, the perception of the conscious perceptions and the intentional behaviors that interact with the environment change what is part of the identity of the baby and what is not, and gradually learns the delimitation of themselves and separation between themselves and their environment. So this is quite rapid learning and adaptation of the identity in the context of a very young baby. Now, identity revisions, of course, happen at the adult age. Here, the examples are clearly about humans, but in the same way, we can imagine that similar identity maintenance changes happen in at least social animals as well. So, for example, we say I'm a researcher and I'm not a technician. Define my identity and also define what I'm not. And this kind of identity revision might be necessary in order to make me feel good about where I am, how I am. Identity checking, communications. Here, the examples are sentences, but really these are communications about the self that are seen to happen within the individual. I will wear the blue shirt and have a tie that fits really with me being a manager. So I have an identity where I define myself as manager, and I generate the right kind of behaviors, like wearing the blue shirt and the tie, in order to fit with my self-defined identity. Or identity enforcement. I have to sell the house. Everybody in my circle lives in the bush part of the city. Living here makes me look really ridiculous. So again, it is a complex behavior induced by the definition of the self-identity, because the individual perceives that they live in the wrong part of the city, which sends the wrong message to their social environment. So they feel that they need to make change, and possibly that this change that they need to make might be financially really difficult. So it may lead effectively to a challenge to their identity, where if, for example, if they are not really able to afford to live in the part of the city where they would like to live according to their identity. Now, there are also subsystems of the mind. These are specialized communications about the self-identity. In the humans, we can see professional identity, so how we behave and how we work in our professional context at work, or the within family identity, where it is about how we interact in our family context with our spouse, children, relatives, and so on. So as you see, in all these cases, the identity is defined by a particular social context, since most of these behaviors defining the identity are in a social context with interaction with other humans. Now, finally moving to the brain complexity. Clearly, brains without memory and information subsystems, which are, for example, the jellyfish neural network, is much less complex, and in general these brains and these nervous systems are much less complex. But the ones which have memory and information subsystems, and possibly even a communication system that defines the identity of the self-identity in the sense of the mind of that animal. These are much more complex brains and lead to much more complex behavior. Same way, the cortex complexity is different for different species. The animals which have more associative structures, for example, vertebrates, but also, for example, octopuses, have much more complex behaviors and much more complex definitions of their identity. Then they have more associative cortex, more associative part of the brain in case of brains which do not have complex. And generally more complex identity leads to definition of the personality. So we think that all those animals which have sufficiently complex brains, sufficiently complex cortex, in the case of vertebrates, the ones which develop personality, and these are the ones where the interaction with conspecifics, so other animals of the same species, become important and they perform a large part of their life in a kind of social context. So, to summarize, we discussed about the information subsystem of the nervous system, and we defined this as the mind, which is the communication system about the communications over long-term memories, the interpretation of these, the interpretation, the conscious interpretation of perceptions, and the intentional actions and intentional behaviors generated by the brain. We discussed about how identity violations happen in the context of the brain and the mind, and how the adaptations happen in response to these. And finally, briefly, we discussed about the complexity of the brain and the mind. Finally, let's close this lecture with a question and answers section. So, what do you think? Is it true that the key question of the identity subsystem is the who am I? So clearly this is the identity subsystem of the brain, and that's how we defined the identity subsystem of the brain. If there is this subsystem, then that is aiming to define the individual, the identity of the individual, answering the who am I question. Clearly this is much more meaningful in the context of humans, but most likely applies in the context of other animals, at least in the case of social animals as well. Second question, is it true that the mind is an independent system from the brain? And our interpretation here that we said that that's not true. The mind is a subsystem of the brain. It is based on the brain, where the brain provides the substrate of the communications which constitute the mind. The third question, is it true that self-analysis paradoxes lead to damages in the mind system? And the answer is that in the context of what we said, or in our interpretation of the mind, this is indeed the case. So when the mind experiences self-analysis paradoxes, behaviors which do not fit the definition of the identity, or perceptions that do not fit, that leads to these paradoxes which damage the mind system, potentially reduce it, or at least trigger the reorganization, recalculation of the mind system. Fourth question, is it true that the lack of reproduction of the identity system due to the paradoxes may lead to triggering of self-destruction? And that's how we define, as I said, this is somewhat speculative interpretation of this theory, but certainly in this context, that's what we said, that if there are regular paradoxes, this lead to the triggering of the self-destruction of the identity and the self-destruction of the individual as well. Finally, is it true that the brains with more associative structures characterize more complex organisms? And the answer is yes. That's what you said, that generally as you have more associative structures, more the ability to process and manage long-term memories, you get more complex organisms with more complex behavior. Thank you.